So, welcome to this session of The World in Numbers with a focus on risks. I am Samir Saran, President of the Observer Research Foundation, and I have the privilege of presenting a deck of slides that will take you through the Global Risk Report 2025. And after that, I'll be joined by a colleague from Chatham House, the director, Bronwen Maddox, who will give her responses and first reactions to the risks report. Before we begin, let me also provide the statutory announcement. If you're engaging with this report and with the work here, please use the hashtag wef.ch. And that's the way to engage with us. Let me also welcome those who are joining us online. For those who are joining us in person, please get your headphones and headsets so that you can hear what we are presenting. And you can also pose us questions towards the very end. We'll have 10 minutes for that towards the end of this presentation. Channel 2 is the channel to engage with us. 2025 marks this is the 20th edition of the Global Risk Report, and we today want to really evaluate how did the perceptions around risks evolve in the last 20 years. 2006 was the first report, and each of the report tracks various variables both on severity and variability. So how severe is the assessment of each risk, and what is the variation of the risk across different indicators that we track. So for example, if you see inequality, very high rank, which means very severe. Change to earth systems, extreme weather events, natural resources, these are all high and severe risks, right? So this is the ranking of risks based on severity. On the y-axis, you see the volatility of each of these risks, which means the change in the assessment of both the potential and the occurrence. And in that sense, we see frontier technologies as being very volatile, involuntary migration being volatile, adverse outcomes being volatile as well. So basically, the x-axis tells you the assessment of the severity of the risk, and the y-axis, the variability over 20 years, how at different moments experts have assessed the risk to be potentially deleterious. This is the 20-year matrix. And of course, you can see that across 20 years, the societal risks clearly rank on top, and you can see the most volatile are the technological and frontier technology risks. So in some sense, this is 20 years of work in one slide. Now, of course, I'll walk you through each of the risks so that you can engage with them individually, but this is how the risks landscape looks over 20 editions of the Global Risk Report. And of course, I've had the privilege of serving in a few of those undertakings as well. Certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been part of this undertaking. So let me now take you through each of the risks, or at least the most important ones. Let me first turn to the societal risk. As you can see, inequality and clearly polarization are very high in terms of the severity. And this is something that all of us have lived through. We see it in our elections, we see it in our debates, we see it in our commentaries, and you see all of us looking and focusing at these 2 or 3 important aspects. And when you see when you see inequality and lack of economic opportunity, that forms a spectrum of concerns that are agitated in our minds and in our media most often. Erosion of civil rights, and of course, decline in health and well-being also creates the societal risk. But as you can see, labor shortage, involuntary migration, amongst these are the most volatile risks. And depending on the season we are in, we see a movement of these particular risks. Let me turn to the environmental risks. Look, I think we are living climate change. What this slide tells us, and certainly do pick up the Global Risks Report. You will have a 2-year timeline, you'll have a 10-year timeline, and both of them tell you climate change is real, we are living it. These are not predictions anymore, these are experiences. And interestingly, natural resource shortages, access to resources is an interesting risk that everyone is speaking about. Of course, Earlier, it was energy access. Today, it is the much broader basket of all that is needed to fuel our lives, and that forms a crucial and important risk. Critical change to Earth's systems is volatile and high, and this is something that again we are noticing. Pollution comes in strongly as well, and yes, it is variable, but it is consistently ranked high, and that is something that. People are again engaging with in different geographies. And of course, non-weather natural disasters is the most volatile of all risks, depending on the moment we are experiencing that particular point of time. Let's now turn to one particular aspect. Now, when we look at climate change, and I don't know if some of you joined the cooperation barometer presentation yesterday, you saw that we have very strong partnerships and collaborations on generating and mobilizing climate finance, and yet we have not done that well in mitigating emissions. And one of the reasons is that the developing nations are just not receiving enough share of climate finance, and they are the frontline nations in responding to climate change. More than 2/3 of future emissions are going to happen out of these geographies, and less than 20% of climate finance reaches these geographies. There is a asymmetry that needs to be responded to. Let's go to the next slide, which is on economic risks. And here, of course, two particular risks have remained consistent and worthy of some concern. Let me just tell you, I don't know why, but the world is more optimistic on the economic side than I am. And generally, we have noticed over 20 years there is a flavor of economic optimism running through it. We've had two particular concerns in my assessment. One is the asset bubble risk, and of course the household debt. I think these are two particular risks that have appeared in certain editions of our efforts, but largely maybe it's human nature, but we are looking at a slightly optimistic skew when it comes to economic risks. Let me move to the technological risks. And again, I think we would see censorship and surveillance of different kinds being a area of concern, and we have seen that across various editions, that they have been prevalent. We have also seen misinformation and disinformation being very volatile, but being certainly present in more recent of these reports. The adverse impacts of AI technology is a recent entrant, but still volatile in its presence in the report. And in some sense, we see besides these particular the risks and trends, we see cyber particularly and the digital mediums generally being an area of concern for most businesses, at least, and certainly most governments and political leadership. So, for example, one of the big questions we are dealing with more recently is around what do frontier technologies, emerging technologies, AI, and other new frontiers do to our societies, our elections, our democracies, our engagements with each other, and of course, being human in this age. And in some sense, we still have to marry our insecurity around the digital domain with the presence of the digital that is creating insecurity within society. And I think these two hybrid risks are going to be prevalent, as you saw in the first societal risk slide, where you saw that polarization and misinformation was a very high risk, along with cybersecurity that businesses focus on. Let me move to the geopolitical risk. And of course, unfortunately, state-based armed conflict is a reality. We have more conflict now than we had in the last few decades. Intrastate violence, again, something that's prevalent. The fear of CBRN, biological and nuclear weapons, or some crude forms of it being deployed, continues to be a risk, though low in severity. And of course, geo-economic confrontation. I don't want to name the reasons behind it, but geo-economic confrontation looms large, and is financial systems, instruments, and economic corridors are all being weaponized, and that's something, though volatile, still prevalent here. Now, this is the perfect time for me to invite my colleague Bronwen from Chatham House to share with us her thoughts, reflections on this particular uh, study, and perhaps even marrying it to some of what you've been doing in your own life, research life.
Thank you very much indeed, Samir. Thank you. It's fascinating to be here. And I was wondering which slide you were going to give me. I was looking forward to the tightrope one from the start. This has been such an interesting survey, and all the more for the years, now 20 years, and the ability to make comparisons over those years. And also, if you go into the detail of this fascinating study, the comparisons between countries. Which I really urge people to do. And I was gripped by it last night, even though much competition for things to look at. I wanted to pick out one of the things that Samir said, because I think it comes out very strikingly. And it's a point of concern for me, because the things that show here highly as risks are the things that tend to get attention from governments or from gatherings like this or from international bodies. They're big on people's agenda, people are worried about it, let's do something about it. So one point I'm concerned about is that the economy at the moment is ranking quite low comparatively in many countries, in people's fears. If you take a step back and just think of this gathering that we're having now at Davos, not just this particular one, but the whole meeting at Davos this week. And it seems to me there are two broadly optimistic assumptions that are behind all the many conversations here. And many of those are conversations about things to worry about. But one of them is pretty much, as far as you can make a judgment, the US and China really do not want a fighting war with each other, which would be a catastrophe for the world. And the other one, broadly, is that there is not going to be a big financial crisis for either the US or indeed China. And then these other conversations that we've been having about many of the hotspots and flashpoints of the world, then those roll on, but broadly against that backdrop. But I'm still concerned about, as I said, even against that backdrop, which I broadly agree with, I'm concerned with the way that people have portrayed economic risk here. Because we have a lot of economic risk at the moment, disguised, if you like, by some of the very live conflicts, whether in the Middle East or Ukraine or so on. Economic growth is proving very hard for governments to get hold of. Not in every place, and the American growth at the moment is the envy of much of the world. But where governments want to push that growth ahead, they find it very hard to find the recipe to do it. And we're sitting in a continent at the moment that is finding that very much indeed. For mature democracies, they're finding it extremely hard to work out what to do if they're in government. And it is fused with them so quickly with the politics that it's very easy to jump to talk about the politics, the populism or whatever, without thinking that these are at heart, a lot of them, economic problems, how to run a mature country, if you happen to be in a mature country, how to get people to pay tax and so on. And in countries that different figuration that are trying to grow and raise the affluence per head. Again, the question of what can government do? So I was nervous there. I was nervous looking at it, particularly given the threats to globalization that we're looking at, the threats of tariffs, of countries retreating into their own blocks. And as we've heard in many Davos sessions, the need right across the planet for great quantities of energy as cheaply as possible to fuel all the transformation that countries want. So that was one concern I had there. And I was interested as well, you came right at the end, Samir, to this point about truth and misinformation. And it comes up really quite recently in this. And that is understandable. But I didn't get a sense from this of what countries and people wanted to do about it, whether they felt in an abstract way it was a threat to their democracy or they were really feeling it was a threat to their business, and so on. So I had a lot of questions around that. But I also took some encouragement from all this, that some things had come down. People were less worried about them in the past, and perhaps a little bit more confident about the ability of their societies to deal with conflict internally. I'm going to stop there. That's just some observations, but I really have to thank everyone who's worked on this. For this, maybe you want to come back on some of these points.
Bronwen, I want you to stay with me on this particular point, and very valid observations. And when I read the report, and since in some sense I'm an interested party in the production of this report, I did notice that while the economic risks cluster has a rather optimistic view or rather neutral view, in spite of what's been happening, the risks associated with our economic well-being are actually captured in the societal risks. And there
that is a really interesting point.
And there you see inequality.
So it's a category.
Correct.
That
I think that's a clustering effect where inequality and lack of economic opportunities being captured in societal risks, while the economic cluster has not necessarily addressed those. Now, I think that's a clustering effect.
That is a really
important
point.
And because it is over time, it was perhaps to normalize it in these groups. So I think, please, my takeaway is that please read the entirety of the report, because you will then start seeing that what is obviously a risk has been captured perhaps differently. So, for example,
and can I make another point?
Yeah,
then on that, encouraging people to read the whole report. Which is, if you look at the environmental risk here, so it has risen, but it's not flashing red at the top if you look at the whole world together. But if you go into the country by country reporting, where people are concerned, for example, about water, they are really, really concerned. It is right at the top. And by putting it all together, we're actually not capturing just how urgent the environmental concerns are in some countries where they're hitting home. There is almost nothing more important.
No, absolutely. And I must clarify that the risks report is not a prescriptive report for governments to adopt certain positions. We are not trying to give policy solutions for societies or businesses. I think people have to come to their own conclusions on disinformation and censorship. Look, you have countries from Canada to Australia and everyone in between talking about censorship of some form to protect their democracies and to protect their social media spaces, right? So countries are responding to that risk. It's not on the basis of the report that we have produced. Our report only catches the perceptive risk assessments of experts, and then it is their ecosystems that are necessarily responding to it. So I think people are responding to misinformation and disinformation, but I think we now have 10 minutes for audience questions, and for those who've been engaging with us. Let me turn it over to you. Bronwen, you will need a headset as well. So I'm going to wait for you to pose your questions to Bronwen or to me. So please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, sir. And I must, we have reached an arrangement. All the difficult questions go to her.
Perfect. It's always better for women to answer difficult questions. How are you measuring inequality? And I'm asking this because if you look at inequality among countries, inequality has dropped considerably, especially since China and India have been growing so much over the past few decades. So what is your data for arguing that inequality is a big risk, and what measures of inequality are you using?
Okay. No, so to respond to that, we do not measure inequality. We are polling a set of experts who are assessing in their view what constitutes a risk. Okay, so it is an individual assessment. There is no scientific baseline for inequality that we are dealing with, and it's largely from an individual viewpoint. So, for example, someone sitting in Brazil who has seen a certain economic experience may rank it in a certain order. Someone in India may do based on that particular view.
But would you say, it's a really interesting question, would you say that they're probably going to interpret it meaning inequality inside their own country?
I would certainly be influenced with my locality. I do not think many experts would extend their own perceptions to distant geography. So I think in the EU, you would have an EU opinion. In India, you would largely be colored by Indian experience. In the US, by what's happening there. But I think it's something for other researchers to take forward and build some nice research on. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for this. It's brilliant. My name's Alicia Lunda and I work in mental health and well-being. And I was really curious to see...
Can you bring the mic close to you? Yeah.
Yes. I was really curious to see mental health, general well-being appearing on the societal risks. Is that new? Is that something you're seeing appearing for one of the first times, and any insights on that?
It's not new, but it's not severe. And as you can see, it's not volatile either. So it remains and it is persistent, but it is not considered to be severe. I think that's what the graph tells us.
Thank you very much. You raised a very important point about the time being to act is now, to find that consensus. But you also raised the issue at being a very fragmented world. What really is your practical suggestion based on this? Thank you.
That she will, Bronwen, what is the practical suggestion to cooperate in a fragmented and polarized world? Your take.
Thank you. This is something that Chatham House is doing. Chatham House is a think tank based in London that we're doing a lot of work on. I wouldn't give up on... much of the world still works, and I don't mean an old US-led order, but actually a lot of the mechanics of international order that every country wants to keep, whether it's about airplanes taking off and landing or communications or whatever, and even some of the economic institutions have really held up surprisingly well in all this fragmentation. So I think we want to keep a degree of what's working. But then in order for institutions to have more legitimacy than in the past, and for it to stop it being a battle between the US and China, I think we need more countries' voices in those, represented in those institutions and influential in those institutions. And I would pick some of them out there. I think for all the acres of text spent on the UN Security Council, it is now time to do something about that. And we would also back really trying to salvage the IMF, which the world needs as a universal body to help stabilize finances and economies of poorer countries, try and salvage that from the wrestling match between the US and China. So I think there are things, but it needs more voices of more countries to stabilize and improve on the institutions that are there. But I wouldn't give up on them. Otherwise, we just have a world without many rules, tiny deals.
I think, just to add to what was mentioned by my colleague, we have to look at clusters of countries aligned on specific themes, domains, and issues who can strengthen multilateral efforts in that particular response. So we would require multilateralism as a whole, and we would require champions who would pick up the cudgels and run a mile on climate. For example, we could have a like-minded set of countries working on green transitions, some on critical minerals, some on technology and regulation and AI governance. So I think plurilateralism will be required as a means to strengthen multilateralism, and also the concept of issue-based partnerships to resolve some tricky, wicked problems outside of the bodies which are dysfunctional today, including the UN Security Council. So peace and security needs a new format while the UN SC remains literally paralyzed. We have a question from the lady there.
Do you see big differences in generations when you do the researches, with interests in the different subjects and yeah?
Look, I think that's a wonderful question. I don't think we have data on that. But maybe the next edition should focus on the age profiles and how they respond to risks. I do know from surveys we do that clearly there is, when it comes to technology, the appreciation of the under 25s is very different to those between 25 and 35, and then the rest, right? So there are three different perceptions on technology alone. Climate change, the younger you go, the more responsible you get. It's a very clear, visible sign. But again, I think that's something for the next edition for us to put together. Any other questions here?
What are the major risks over the long term that both of you are particularly deep down really worried about?
Nuclear proliferation is back again. It wasn't particularly high on here. No. It'd come down, but I think it really is there. And the world, much of it, not in Japan, as they keep saying, but much of the world has forgotten or doesn't know the peculiar horror of those weapons. And I think that is coming back. I would also go for economic ones, just things that threaten growth, even if they're not wars, even if they're not a big collapse in a particular market or something, because they so immediately hurt prosperity, particularly for the world's poorest, and they make all these political problems and social strains much harder to do things about some of the things we want to, including the environment and clean energy. So the deglobalization, that matters. It doesn't come with a banner of fighting attached to it, but it chips away at the prosperity we have been enjoying as a global community, even if everyone hasn't felt it over the last 30 years. Look,
for me, I would say there are 3 categories of risks. I'm not going to go and explain each one of them, but I think the first category is in some ways, the rejection of the institutions we have built over the last 7.5 to 8 decades, including those that preserve non-proliferation and certain international behavior. If we let go of them, I don't think we are ready to build new ones very soon. So in some sense, how do we ensure they sustain while we recreate or reform or in some sense rescript the future? Those need to be. So a rejection of multilateralism en masse is, I think, a big risk, because it leads to development implications, security implications, and growth and prosperity implications. So I think that's the first risk. The second risk is technology, but not in the way we are thinking about it. I think the technology risks is more about what it is doing to us as humans and as societies and as people. In the previous cycles of innovation, great research and innovation was accompanied by great social science. These days, innovation is happening at such a clip that we are not being able to invest in the critical analysis of what it is doing to us as people. And I think we are going blind into a brand new age, and I think that is the second risk. And the third is the planetary risk. I think even the believers in climate action are still staying close to home. If they do not invest in Africa and Asia, the planet will burn for them as well. And I think staying close to home while acknowledging planetary risk is the third risk, that you are not doing enough if you are investing at home. You have to invest in your neighbor's house. Only then will you combat climate action. So I'm going to leave it there. Is there a question here? There.
Thank you. I suppose we've been speaking about climate quite a bit, but I have a question about how our understanding of risk assessment is being shaped also by the climate emergency. And in a way, how should this impact any further policy action that we take in terms of climate preparedness, risk assessment, etc.?
So I'll give you a quick reply and then the final word to you, Bronwen. Quick reply. You can see from the surveys, due to various emergencies over time, we are seeing a heightening of awareness and the severity of climate. In fact, if you look at the 2-year time horizon, you have 4 out of 10 which respond to the planetary challenge and the ecosystem challenge and the climate challenge. And if you look at the 20-year horizon, literally all of it is planetary, besides a couple on societal and one on geopolitics. So the emergencies have mobilized populations to recognize it. What we are lacking is leadership to take this huge public support and create policies that shape the future. Final word to you, Bronwen.
Thank you. If we ask, what is the point of talking about risk at all? Well, it's so that you can do something. But many risks you can respond to, and if you get it wrong, you can change. With climate, you can't. I mean, this is the central point of it. We have to take the action now, and we know that we need to. We just don't know how bad it might get. I think there is a seriousness that there was not 5, 6, 7 years ago, even in governments. I think that is reflected in the seriousness of the COP discussions, even though the outcome inevitably disappointed many people in many countries. But the countries are trying to move forward on that, perhaps with the exception of the new government in the US, which we have got all this way without mentioning. And the survey, I think, was taken before the US election.
Correct.
But I think there is a seriousness there.
Look, don't blame Trump for climate change. Yeah. Everyone else contributed to it. Wow. So, let's give him a chance. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Bronwen, for your wonderful remarks. And this is all from this particular
It's a great
segment.
report. Do read it.
Thank you.